In June 1968, an NBC executive laughed aloud in the control room, calling Elvis Presley a washed-up Hollywood joke. Less than an hour later, that same man was gripping the mixing console, weeping uncontrollably in the dark. If you love deep, untold moments from music history that the mainstream media conveniently forgot, hit the subscribe button right now. It takes 1 second, and it ensures you never miss our weekly historical breakdowns. Let's get into the story. On June 27, 1968, the air inside NBC's Studio 4 in Burbank, California, was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, overheated vacuum tubes, and unspoken contempt. To the corporate brass at the National Broadcasting Company, the 3-day television tapping scheduled for that week was not a historic cultural event. It was a contractual chore. It was a glorified commercial sponsored by the Singer Sewing Machine Company, designed to sell holiday sewing kits to American housewives. Up in the glass-paneled control room, television executives and senior broadcast producers looked down at the studio floor with arms crossed and cynical smiles on their faces. Among the network veterans watching the monitors was a high-ranking production supervisor, a man who had spent 2 decades producing live television for the biggest stars in show business. To him, the man walking onto the soundstage was a relic. An embarrassing ghost from the 1950s who had long outlived his cultural relevance. "Look at him," the producer reportedly scoffed to his colleagues, lighting a cigarette as the camera crew adjusted their pedestals. "The world has moved on to Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, and we're stuck producing a Christmas special for a guy who sings to dogs in cheap beach movies." The room chuckled in quiet agreement. And from a purely objective standpoint in the summer of 1968, the producer's arrogance wasn't entirely baseless. Elvis Presley was 33 years old, and by almost every standard in the music industry, his career was clinically dead. It had been more than 7 years since he had performed in front of a live, paying audience. For the better part of a decade, his legendary manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had locked him in a golden Hollywood cage, churning out 3 formulaic, low-budget musical comedies a year. Films like Clambake, Paradise, Hawaiian Style, and Stay Away, Joe. The soundtrack albums were artistic disasters, contractual obligations where the man who had once terrified American parents and revolutionized global culture was forced to sing novelty songs like Do the Clam and Yoga Is as Yoga Does. While Elvis was stuck on soundstages in Hawaii pretending to drive speedboats, the world outside had exploded into cultural revolution. The British invasion had conquered American radio. Bob Dylan had rewritten the rules of songwriting. The Rolling Stones, The Doors, and Cream were playing heavy, dangerous, politically charged rock and roll. More than that, the summer of 1968 was a season of profound national grief and turmoil. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis, Elvis's own backyard, just 2 months earlier. Senator Robert F. Kennedy had been shot and killed in Los Angeles only 3 weeks prior, right down the street from where Elvis was staying. Cities across America were burning with anti-war protests and civil rights unrest. In this fractured, volatile landscape, what could a 33-year-old former teen idol possibly offer? Colonel Parker had already decided what the show should be, a harmless, squeaky-clean holiday broadcast. The Colonel's vision was simple and sterile. Elvis would walk out in a bright red Christmas sweater, stand beside a plastic snowman, sing 20 Christmas carols, wish the country a happy holiday season, and plug Singer sewing machines. It was safe, it was profitable, and it was completely devoid of an artistic soul. The network suits at NBC were more than happy to oblige. They expected a cheesy, profitable holiday special. They expected an obedient former superstar who would read his cue cards, collect his paycheck, and disappear back into Hollywood obscurity. What the executives in the control room did not know, however, was that inside a small, dimly lit dressing room downstairs, a quiet mutiny had been brewing for weeks. The rebellion started with a 26-year-old television director named Steve Binder. When NBC initially approached Binder to direct the project, he turned it down. He told the network that Elvis Presley was a dated, uninspired novelty. But Binder agreed to meet with Elvis privately in his office, expecting to find an arrogant, out-of-touch celebrity surrounded by bodyguards. Instead, Binder found a tall, startlingly handsome man packing back and forth, visibly terrified. When the 2 men sat down alone, Elvis looked at the young director and asked a question that stunned Binder to his core. What do you honestly think of my career? Binder didn't sugarcoat his answer. He told Elvis that his recent movies were awful, his music had lost its edge, and the entire youth culture viewed him as an irrelevant artifact of the past. Elvis didn't get angry. He bowed his head, stared at his boots, and quietly replied, "You're right. I've been asleep for 10 years. I don't know who I am anymore. And I'm terrified that if I walk out on a stage, nobody is going to care." In that moment, Binder realized two things. First, that Elvis Presley was nursing a deep, agonizing artistic insecurity. And second, that beneath the Hollywood polish and the Colonel's suffocating control, there was still a ferocious, raw musical genius waiting to explode if someone just gave him permission to be dangerous again. Binder made a secret pact with Elvis. They were going to throw out the Colonel's Christmas sweater. They were going to throw out the plastic snowman. They were not going to make a cute holiday special. They were going to make a statement of survival. Binder brought in costume designer Bill Ballou, who created something that had never been seen on network television, a skin-tight, two-piece suit made entirely of black motorcycle leather. It had a high, flared Napoleonic collar, heavy zippers, and zero ornamentation. It was aggressive. It was sexual. It looked less like television wardrobe and more like armor for a street fighter. Then Binder designed a staging concept that made the NBC executives break out in a cold sweat. Instead of a massive, sterile orchestra stage, Binder built a tiny, elevated boxing ring just 10 feet wide, surrounded on all four sides by screaming, unpredictable fans sitting practically in Elvis's lap. There would be no teleprompters, no script, no backup dancers. Just Elvis, his original 1950s guitarist Scotty Moore, his original drummer DJ Fontana, and a pair of acoustic guitars. When the NBC executives saw the setup during rehearsals, they were appalled. The production supervisor up in the booth shook his head, muttering that Binder was setting the network up for a public train wreck. "You can't put him out there unscripted," the producer warned over the intercom. "He hasn't performed live since 1961. He's going to freeze. He's going to forget the lyrics. He's going to look ridiculous in that leather suit. This isn't live television. It's a suicide mission." Down in the dressing room an hour before the first tapping, the producer's prediction looked like it was about to come true. Elvis was physically trembling. His skin was pale, his hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't tie his boots, and his stomach was in knots. Minutes before he was scheduled to walk onto the soundstage, Elvis grabbed Steve Binder by the arm, looked him dead in the eye, and whispered in a choked voice, "Steve, I can't do it. I can't go out there. My mind has gone completely blank. I don't remember any of the songs." Binder looked at the trembling king of rock and roll and knew that everything hung on the next 30 seconds. If Elvis walked away now, his career was permanently over. He would spend the rest of his life as a punchline. "Elvis," Binder said calmly, placing a hand on the black leather shoulder, "just walk out to the stage. If you get out there and you really can't do it, I'll cut the cameras, we'll make an excuse, and we'll cancel the show. But you have to walk through those doors." Elvis swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and nodded. Up in the control room, the cynical producer leaned back in his swivel chair, a smirk playing across his lips as he watched camera one frame the entrance. Over the talkback headsets, the studio floor manager counted down. 5, 4, 3. The stage doors swung open. Elvis Presley stepped into the arena. The moment his boots hit the edge of the tiny stage, something unnatural happened in Studio 4. The audience, mostly young people who had been recruited off the street because the Colonel hadn't bothered to distribute tickets properly, let out a deafening, visceral scream. Elvis walked to the center of the ring, grabbed the microphone stand, and stood frozen for a few seconds. His hand on the mic was visibly shaking. The producer in the control room muttered, "Here it comes, he's choking." Then Elvis looked up. His eyes caught the studio floodlights and a slow, wicked, razor-sharp grin spread across his face. The fear vanished. In its place was something feral, something hungry. He struck the strings of his electric guitar with a vicious, percussive slap and leaned into the microphone. A deep, snarling baritone blasted through the studio monitors. "If you're looking for trouble, you came to the right place." In the control booth, the smirk on the senior producer's face instantly vanished. What happened over the next 45 minutes was not a television broadcast. It was an exorcism. Elvis tore through Guitar Man, Lawdy Miss Claudy, Baby What You Want Me to Do, and Heartbreak Hotel with an intensity that bordered on violent. He was sweating profusely within minutes, the black leather clinging to his frame, his dark hair falling across his eyes. He didn't just sing the blues, he attacked them. He dropped to his knees, slammed his fists against the boxing ring floor, teased the women in the front row, and laughed with a raw, unhinged joy that had been buried beneath a decade of Hollywood mediocrity. Down on the floor, Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana were playing like men possessed, trying to keep up with the sheer, locomotive momentum of the man they had backed in Memphis juke joints 14 years earlier. Up in the glass booth, the atmosphere transformed entirely. The technicians stopped chatting. The cigarette smoke hung motionless in the air. Nobody was checking the production clocks. Nobody was looking at the commercial rundowns. Every single engineer, cameraman, and network executive was staring at the monitors with their jaws slack. The senior producer who had laughed an hour earlier was now standing up from his chair. He had taken off his headset. He was leaning so close to the master monitor that his breath was fogging the glass. He wasn't looking at a washed-up movie star. He was watching the undisputed king of rock and roll reclaim his throne by sheer force of will. Elvis wasn't singing for a paycheck. He was singing for his dignity. He was singing for his artistic life. Every cynical assumption the network had made about Elvis Presley disintegrated with every crack of his voice and every sweep of his arm. But the biggest shock of the night was yet to come. As the raw acoustic jam session wrapped up to thunderous, standing ovations from the studio floor, the production moved to the final, crucial component of the special, the grand finale. Colonel Tom Parker was standing off to the side of the stage, chewing on his unlit cigar. He was furious that there hadn't been a single Christmas song in the entire broadcast. The colonel demanded that the closing number be a traditional performance of "I'll Be Home for Christmas," insisting that anything else would alienate Middle America and anger the singer executives. Steve Binder knew that ending this triumphant, dangerous rock and roll comeback with a generic holiday carol would destroy the entire artistic integrity of the program. 2 nights earlier, Binder had secretly called the show's vocal arranger, Walter Earl Brown. He told Brown to stay up all night and write a song specifically for Elvis. Not a pop tune, not a love song, a social anthem. A song that directly addressed the bloodshed, racial division, and assassinations tearing the country apart in 1968. Brown returned with a track titled "If I Can Dream." The lyrics were a direct echo of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech, asking why humanity couldn't live in peace, compassion, and understanding. When Walter Earl Brown first played the demo for Elvis in a quiet rehearsal room, Elvis listened with his eyes closed. When the final piano chord faded, tears were streaming down his cheeks. He looked up at Binder and said, "I will never sing another song I don't believe in. I'm singing this, and I'm singing it for the finale." When Colonel Parker found out, he exploded. "That's not Elvis's style. It's not a Christmas song. We're not doing it." Elvis, for the first time in his professional career, looked his legendary manager in the eye and said quietly, "Colonel, we're doing it." Now, on the soundstage, the set was prepared for the final shot of the entire tapping. There was no band on stage. There were no props. The background consisted only of massive 50-foot-tall red marquee lights spelling out the name, Elvis. Elvis stepped out from the wings wearing a pristine, double-breasted white suit designed by Bill Ballou. He stood dead center on the dark stage, illuminated by a single, blinding white spotlight. Up in the control room, the master audio fader was pushed up. The deep, swelling brass and soaring gospel choir of the backing track filled the studio speakers. Elvis closed his eyes, bowed his head, and waited for his cue. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out was not the smooth, polished croon of his movie soundtracks. It was a cry of pure, agonizing human vulnerability. There must be lights burning brighter somewhere. Got to be birds flying higher in a sky more blue. As the song built, Elvis began to lose himself entirely in the performance. His body convulsed with every note. His right fist clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face contorted with grief, rage, hope, and desperation. By the time he reached the bridge of the song, he was bent almost double at the waist, pulling every ounce of breath from the depths of his lungs. He was singing for Martin Luther King. He was singing for Bobby Kennedy. He was singing for every kid dying in the jungles of Vietnam, and he was singing for his own lost soul. We're lost in a cloud with too much rain. We're trapped in a world that's troubled with pain. Down on the floor, female audience members were openly weeping. Hardened studio stagehands who had worked on hundreds of broadcasts were standing frozen, tears running down their dusty faces. Up in the control room, the silence was absolute. Steve Binder turned away from the camera switcher to glance at the cynical senior producer, who had spent the morning mocking Elvis as a has-been. The producer was not sitting down. He was leaning against the master audio console, both hands gripping the edge of the desk for support. His head was lowered, his shoulders were shaking violently, and tears were dripping directly off his chin onto the equipment below. The man who had laughed at the king of pop culture history was now completely shattered by the sheer, undeniable spiritual power of what he was hearing. He couldn't speak. He couldn't look up. All he could do was listen as Elvis Presley laid his entire soul bare on a magnetic tape. Elvis reached the climactic final phrase. "Deep in my heart, there's a trembling question. Still, I am sure that the answer's gonna come somehow. Oh, out there in the dark, there's a beckoning candle. And while I can think, while I can talk, while I can stand, while I can walk, while I can dream, please let my dream come true right now." On the final, soaring note, Elvis dropped to his knees, dropped his hands to his sides, and hung his head in total physical and emotional exhaustion. The single white spotlight clicked off. For nearly 20 seconds, Studio 4 was as silent as a cathedral. Nobody cheered, nobody applauded, nobody dared to breathe. Then the entire room, cameramen, floor managers, executives, fans, and technicians, erupted into a deafening, earth-shaking roar that shook the very foundation of the Burbank facility. When the NBC television special finally aired on the night of December 3rd, 1968, it was not called the Singer Holiday Show. It was simply titled Elvis. The broadcast captured a staggering 42% of the entire American television viewing audience that evening, making it NBC's highest-rated program of the entire year and one of the most-watched musical broadcasts in the history of television. The critics were left speechless. The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and every major publication across the globe declared that Elvis Presley had pulled off the single greatest artistic resurrection in the history of modern entertainment. In one 60-minute broadcast, he had obliterated 8 years of Hollywood mediocrity, silenced every critic who had declared him obsolete, and reclaimed his rightful title as the supreme cultural force of his era. The special changed everything. It gave Elvis the courage to walk away from Hollywood movies forever. Within months, he entered American Sound Studio in Memphis to record masterpiece tracks like Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto, before launching his legendary, record-breaking live residency at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. Years later, Steve Binder reflected on that fateful week in June 1968. He recalled how close the world came to losing Elvis to the corporate machine, and how a room full of arrogant television executives had arrived expecting a joke and left as believers. That senior NBC producer who had wept at the audio console never spoke publicly about his change of heart. He didn't need to. The tape of that performance exists forever as historical proof of an undeniable truth. You can manufacture fame, you can package entertainment, and you can buy publicity. But true, transcendent artistic genius cannot be faked, cannot be managed, and can never be bought. On that humid night in Burbank, in a tiny boxing ring surrounded by black leather and red marquee lights, a laughing control room learned the hard way that you never count out a true king when he's fighting for his soul. If this story gave you chills, you're not alone. What do you think is the single greatest moment from the 1968 comeback special? Was it the raw black leather jam or that unforgettable performance of If I Can Dream? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend who appreciates real music history. I'll see you in the next one.